Welcome to Secrets in the Shadows, the channel where we uncover some of the most chilling and haunting true crime stories. Today, we're diving into a case that shocked an entire community and the world. This is the heartbreaking story of the Petit Family murders. Before we begin, please like this video, hit the subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Secrets in the Shadows. Now, settle in as we take you step by step through one of our time's most tragic and horrifying crimes. The Petit Family was a picture of success and happiness. They lived in Cheshire, Connecticut, a quiet suburban town known for its safety and tight-knit community. The family consisted of 4 members. William Petit is a respected endocrinologist. His wife, Jennifer Hawk Petit, was warm-hearted and devoted to raising their daughters. Their eldest daughter, Haley, 17, is a recent high school graduate bound for Dartmouth College. Their youngest, Michaela, 11, was a sweet and artistic child who loved to cook and cared deeply for her family. They were the kind of family everyone admired, kind, compassionate, and hardworking. But in the early morning hours of July 23, 2007, their lives would be changed forever. Cheshire, Connecticut, was a town where people felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked. A peaceful community where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. But on the night of July 22, 2007, darkness crept into the heart of the Petit family's home. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky were 2 men with criminal pasts and no regard for human life. That evening, they were driving around, looking for an easy target, a home they could invade for money. They spotted Jennifer Hawk Petit and her youngest daughter, Michaela, at the local grocery store. They were buying groceries for a family dinner. To Hayes and Komisarjevsky, Jennifer and Michaela looked like the perfect victims. Komisarjevsky later admitted in his confession that he followed the pair home, observing the Petit house. To him, it seemed like an easy mark, a wealthy family, no apparent security system, and quiet neighbors. They decided this was the house they'd strike. The quiet night of July 23, 2007 in Cheshire was about to turn into a nightmare. The Petit family had no way of knowing that their lives would be shattered forever in the coming hours. In the darkness, 2 men, Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky, were setting their plan in motion. These men had been planning the attack for weeks. Hayes, who was a convicted rapist, and Komisarjevsky, who had a history of break-ins, knew how to terrorize and manipulate. Together, they had decided to target the Petit family, but their plan would soon take a horrifying turn that neither could have predicted. The family, unaware of the danger that lurked outside, was fast asleep. Dr. William Petit, a well-known and respected endocrinologist, was resting in the sunroom after a long day at work. His wife, Jennifer, and daughters Haley and Michaela were tucked in their beds upstairs. It was around 3 a.m. when the nightmare began. Komisarjevsky, the more calculated and daring of the 2, took the first step. He quietly approached the basement door, which was left unlocked, and slipped inside. He was careful, too careful, to make any noise that might alert the family. Once inside, he found Dr. Petit, who was asleep on the couch in the sunroom. The strike came quickly. Komisarjevsky swung the baseball bat, hitting Dr. Petit in the head. The blow was so hard that it caused a concussion, knocking him unconscious for several moments, but not completely. Dr. Petit, despite the pain, was still semi-conscious. He couldn't make sense of the blurry images and voices around him, but he knew one thing: his life was in danger. He had to fight for his family. As Komisarjevsky tied Dr. Petit up and dragged him to the basement, Hayes quietly entered the home through the same unlocked door. Hayes, being the more violent and unpredictable of the 2, quickly went upstairs to begin his terrifying assault on the rest of the family. The first room he entered was Haley's. The 17-year-old, who was fast asleep, was jolted awake by the sound of someone entering her room. She looked up to find a man standing over her. The terror that flooded her body was instant. Without a chance to scream, she was tied up and forced to stay silent. Next, Hayes moved to Michaela's room. The 11-year-old was sleeping soundly, unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. Michaela, who had been described by her teachers as sweet and energetic, woke up to the terrifying sight of a stranger in her room. Both girls were bound by the intruders, completely at their mercy. It was in these moments that the unimaginable fear began to set in. They were trapped, their lives hanging in the balance. But what was even worse was the realization that their mother, Jennifer, was also being held in another room. Meanwhile, Jennifer, hearing the noises coming from her daughter's rooms, began to panic. She knew something was terribly wrong. When she was pulled out of bed by one of the intruders, she fought back with every ounce of strength she had. But she was overpowered. She was tied up in her own bedroom, separated from her daughters, and unable to protect them. As the family was restrained, the two men began to ransack the house. The walls of their sanctuary, once a home filled with love, now became the scene of chaos and horror. Yet despite their fear and confusion, Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela never gave up hope. They tried to keep calm, whispering to each other through the terror, hoping that they might find a way to escape. But escape was slipping further and further from their reach. Komisarjevsky, who had moved Dr. Petit into the basement, knew that the family's wealth could be their ticket to escape. He had noticed that the Petits seemed to live a comfortable life, and he thought they might have a significant amount of money. But there was no cash to be found. That's when the plan took a darker turn. Komisarjevsky realized they would have to force Jennifer to go to the bank to withdraw money. He and Hayes knew the stakes had risen. They couldn't afford to leave the house without more cash, so they devised a plan that would make sure Jennifer cooperated. They promised that if she didn't help, her family would pay the price. But inside Dr. Petit's mind, something else was happening. He had been struggling to free himself from the ropes, trying to push through the pain of his injuries. Though he was bleeding from the blows to his head, his determination was growing stronger. He knew that if he didn't act now, his family would be lost. In the basement, Dr. Petit had only one thought: survival. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins despite the dizziness and the blood loss. He knew the house was still standing, that there was a chance to get help. His mind sharpened, and the cold reality set in. The only way to stop this nightmare was to act. As Jennifer, still bound and terrified, was forced to comply with the demands of the intruders, she quietly prayed that somehow her husband would escape and save their daughters. But little did she know, Dr. Petit was already making his move. Haley and Michaela, still in their rooms, fought their own battle with fear. They didn't know it yet, but their fate was sealed with every second that passed. The horror of their ordeal was only beginning to unfold. As the minutes stretched into hours, the terror inside the Petit home was escalating. Jennifer Petit, still tied up in her room, was now forced to do the unthinkable. Komisarjevsky, the mastermind behind the scheme, had made it clear, if she didn't cooperate, her family would suffer. She had no choice. Jennifer was ordered to get dressed and forced out of her room by the intruders. They made sure she was closely watched as she moved around the house, their presence a constant reminder of the grave danger they were in. They were playing a high-stakes game. Jennifer's compliance was their key to getting what they wanted. Jennifer, however, wasn't giving up on her family. She had a plan in her mind. She knew the bank was just a few miles away, and as long as she stayed calm, there was a chance she could buy her family time. Her heart was racing, but her survival instinct kicked in. She had to protect her daughters. Komisarjevsky handed Jennifer the car keys and forced her to drive to the bank, accompanied by Hayes. The drive to the bank was quiet, the air thick with tension. Jennifer was desperately trying to think of any way she could stall anyway. She could make it out of this alive, but the clock was ticking. As they reached the bank, Jennifer's mind raced. She knew that once they were inside, there would be no turning back. There was only one chance to get help, and she had to take it. The moment they entered the bank, Jennifer knew she had to act. Hayes, who was much more unpredictable, kept a tight grip on her, constantly reminding her that her family was still at risk. But Jennifer saw an opportunity. Jennifer made her move when she reached the teller. In what would be her final attempt to save her family, she slipped a quiet message to the teller, a small note hidden under her hand. It read, "I am being robbed. Call the police. Please." Jennifer's heart raced as the teller read the note. The seconds felt like hours. Would the teller understand in time? Would help come before it was too late? As the teller went into action, Jennifer had no idea if the message would make it to the authorities, but she could feel that something was shifting. In the meantime, Hayes, noticing the exchange, grew even more paranoid. He was no fool. He knew Jennifer had just done something dangerous. He wasn't about to let her slip away. Hayes quickly turned to her with growing suspicion. Jennifer, sensing that time was running out, had no choice but to keep her cool. She followed through with the withdrawal, withdrawing a large sum of money, all the while praying that the note would lead to rescue. But as she left the bank, there was a horrifying realization. The worst was yet to come. This was no longer just about money. It was about survival. Once back in the car, the intruder's plan took an even darker turn. What Jennifer didn't know was that the two men had already decided that the family's fate was sealed. They didn't just want money. They wanted to erase the evidence of their crime completely. The Petits were now caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse. The car ride home was thick with an unbearable silence. Inside the house, the tension was escalating. Dr. Petit, still in the basement, had been trying to gather his strength despite the sharp pain in his head. But even though he could hear the movements above, he couldn't do much to stop them. He knew his wife and daughters were in danger. He was helpless and angry. He wanted to scream, to fight, but the ropes were too tight. Jennifer, returning to the house with the cash in hand, had no idea what awaited her and her family. She was hoping against hope that the police had somehow intervened, that the teller had done something to stop the nightmare. But in her gut, she felt the dark turn that things had taken. As Jennifer entered the house, she was immediately met with a devastating reality. Komisarjevsky and Hayes, now more desperate and unpredictable, took control of the situation. The intruders had not only planned to rob the family, they were now planning to erase any evidence of the crime. They set fire to the house, a cruel, heartless move to make sure nothing would remain to connect them to the horrible events. The fire started small at first, just a few flames licking at the floor, but it was enough. It would soon engulf the entire house. The smoke began to spread quickly, filling the rooms, making it harder to breathe, to think, to see. Jennifer and Dr. Petit knew they had to get out, but the ropes, the fire, and the smoke were closing in on them. They were trapped in the very house they had once called home, unable to escape the menacing fire and the terrifying threat of their captors. Meanwhile, outside, the sound of sirens began to grow louder. Jennifer's note had worked. The police were on their way, but it might be too late. Would they get there in time? Would they be able to save the Petits from the burning inferno? Back in the house, Dr. Petit had made one last attempt to free himself. The fire was spreading fast now, but with one final effort, he managed to free himself from the ropes. He couldn't move as fast as he wanted to, but he knew he had to try. He fought through the smoke and flames, his body aching, his mind focused only on getting to his family. But there was no time to waste. His family was still inside, and every second counted. Stumbling through the darkened halls, Dr. Petit's body felt like it might give out at any moment. But his heart urged him forward. He had to get to them. He had to try. As he reached the stairs, the heat from the growing fire above him began to make his skin burn. The flames were already spreading through the house, but Dr. Petit pressed on. His vision blurred, his steps faltering with each one, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't leave them behind. Dr. Petit managed to make his way through the house toward the back door. He pushed it open, the smoke almost choking him as he stumbled into the yard. He collapsed to the ground outside, but his struggle wasn't over. As Dr. Petit lay on the cold ground, gasping for air, he could barely believe he was still alive. His body was battered, but there was a sense of disbelief in the fact that he had escaped the worst. But as he lay there, his thoughts were consumed with his family. His heart pounded, a terrifying realization settling in. Where were they? Were they safe? His hands reached out, trembling, and he tried to call for help. In his weakened state, his voice was barely a whisper, but he shouted anyway. He had to. He had to make sure they knew. He was seen by neighbors who, shocked by his condition, immediately dialed 911. Help had arrived, but it was clear that the most dangerous part of the ordeal was far from over. As the emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found Dr. Petit outside, covered in blood and soot, barely conscious, but still alive. The horror of what had happened in that house was just beginning to dawn on them. With urgency, they moved Dr. Petit to safety, trying to stabilize him as best as they could. But despite the frantic efforts to help, there was little that could be done at the moment. Dr. Petit's injuries were severe, his body a testament to the brutal violence he had endured. His mind, however, was clear. His thoughts, as they raced, were consumed by one singular question. Were Jennifer and the girls still alive? As the paramedics worked, the police began searching the area, trying to get a handle on the situation. And it wasn't long before they realized that the fire, which had consumed so much of the house, had also hidden the full scope of the tragedy. Jennifer and Michaela, Haley, were they gone? Inside the home, the flames were now overwhelming the structure. The fire was raging out of control, and the police officers who had arrived on the scene were now faced with the terrifying task of attempting to enter the house and search for any survivors. Time was running out. Every minute the fire burned, it grew more dangerous for everyone involved. With the house rapidly collapsing, the officers knew there was no room for error. They entered through the back, trying to get to the second floor where Jennifer and the girls were last seen. But as the fire roared in their ears and the walls creaked, their hope began to fade. And then, amidst the suffocating heat and smoke, they heard it. The faintest sound, a cry for help. It was Jennifer's voice. But when the officers reached Jennifer, they found that she had already been overpowered by the fire and smoke. The flames had spread too quickly, and despite her valiant efforts, Jennifer and her daughters had not survived. While Dr. Petit lay in the yard, barely clinging to life, the devastation inside the house was unimaginable. Meanwhile, as the flames continued to rage, the investigation into the perpetrator's whereabouts began. There was one question on everyone's mind. Who had done this, and where were they now? The horror of the Petit family's final moments was still fresh, but the hunt for justice had already begun. Dr. Petit, though still physically fragile, was able to provide authorities with crucial information. His memories of the intruders, although hazy from the trauma and pain, painted a picture of two men, monsters, who had invaded his life with unimaginable cruelty. Dr. Petit's struggle to survive was now matched by his drive to make sure these men were caught. And soon, that would happen. Not long after the tragedy unfolded, the police began to gather the pieces. Their investigation led them to the notorious duo responsible for the unimaginable crime, Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes. These two men had been planning the attack for months, carefully orchestrating every detail with chilling precision. Komisarjevsky, the younger of the two, had been watching the Petit family from a distance. He had studied their routines, learning everything about their lives. Hayes, a man with a criminal record, had been the perfect accomplice, equally willing to partake in this unspeakable act. Together, they were a deadly pair, but their arrogance would eventually be their downfall. After the crime, Komisarjevsky and Hayes tried to flee, but their escape didn't last long. The police, fueled by the need for justice, tracked them down. They didn't get far before they were apprehended, but the real question was, how could two men be so cruel? What had driven them to commit such a horrific act? Komisarjevsky and Hayes were arrested and brought into custody. As the details of their crime became known, it was revealed that they had chosen the Petit family at random. They had no personal motive, no grudge against them. It was purely a matter of opportunity. An opportunity they took, destroying the lives of the Petits in the process. But even as the perpetrators were behind bars, the emotional toll of the crime was far from over. The Petit family's nightmare had left its mark on Dr. Petit, forever changing him. He was now a man left to rebuild a shattered life, to face each day knowing that his beloved family was no longer there. After the heinous crimes committed against the Petit family, the court proceedings would be an intense and painful journey for everyone involved. The trials of Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes became a national spectacle, drawing in people from all walks of life who were eager to see justice served. The questions on everyone's mind were simple, but complex in their implications. Could these two men ever truly be held accountable for the unimaginable suffering they caused? Would their actions ever be fully understood? Or would their true motives remain a mystery? Joshua Komisarjevsky's trial was the first to take place. Charged with 3 counts of murder, sexual assault, arson, and burglary, the gravity of his crimes was immediately clear to everyone in the courtroom. Komisarjevsky, a man with a history of violent crimes and a troubled upbringing, stood accused of one of the most shocking acts of brutality this country had ever witnessed. Komisarjevsky's defense attorneys attempted to argue that his actions were rooted in his difficult past. They pointed to his abusive upbringing, a childhood marred by neglect and violence, hoping to portray him as a product of his environment. They argued that his mental state had been compromised by years of abuse, pushing him to commit these terrible acts. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the argument was weak, and the evidence against him was insurmountable. The prosecution presented evidence that contradicted this defense. They pointed to Komisarjevsky's calculated behavior during the crime, his careful preparation, and his utter lack of remorse for the pain he caused. He had done more than just participate in the crime. He had orchestrated it with chilling precision. His actions were not those of a desperate man driven by his past, but of a man who deliberately chose to inflict terror on a helpless family. As the days passed, the courtroom was filled with testimony that left the jury, and everyone in the room horrified. The brutality of the crime was undeniable. The prosecution showed pictures of the Petit home, burned and destroyed, with the bodies of Jennifer, Michaela, and Haley found in the ashes of their home. Joshua Komisarjevsky's role in this destruction was clear. The court saw him not as a victim of his past, but as a perpetrator of unimaginable evil. The defense continued to fight, presenting arguments about Komisarjevsky's childhood and the influence of his co-defendant, Stephen Hayes, but they couldn't deny the harsh reality. On October 5, 2010, after deliberation, the jury found Joshua Komisarjevsky guilty on all charges. The verdict was a turning point, but the sentencing would be just as contentious. The real question was whether Komisarjevsky would face the death penalty. In Connecticut, the death penalty was still legal, but it was becoming increasingly controversial. The jury deliberated on the punishment, considering the brutal nature of the crime, the suffering of the victims, and the chilling lack of remorse shown by Komisarjevsky. On December 7, 2010, the jury returned with their decision. Komisarjevsky would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Many felt that this sentence was too lenient, and it would become a source of outrage for the victims' families and the public. Next came the trial of Stephen Hayes, the older of the 2 men involved in the Petit family murders. Like Komisarjevsky, Hayes faced multiple charges: 3 counts of murder, sexual assault, arson, and burglary. But Hayes's criminal history was more extensive than Komisarjevsky's, and his actions during the crime were equally brutal. Hayes's trial started on October 18, 2011, and it wasn't long before the prosecution began to make their case. Like Komisarjevsky, Hayes had been planning the attack on the Petit family. He had taken part in the horrific events of that night, playing a major role in the deaths of Jennifer, Michaela, and Haley. Hayes's behavior during the crimes was calculated and cold, and yet as the trial progressed, it was evident that Hayes had been more vocal about his remorse than Komisarjevsky. In fact, Stephen Hayes, in a somewhat unexpected turn, expressed remorse in the courtroom. He apologized for his actions, showing a level of regret that Komisarjevsky had not. But the apology came too late, and it didn't change the fact that he had participated in one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The question on everyone's mind was whether this display of guilt would impact the outcome of the trial. Hayes's defense team tried to use this remorse as a mitigating factor, hoping that it would spare him from the death penalty. They argued that he had acted under the influence of Komisarjevsky, suggesting that he had been manipulated by his younger co-defendant. But the evidence told a different story. Hayes, despite his apparent remorse, had been fully involved in the planning and execution of the murders. His participation in the crimes was just as significant as Komisarjevsky's, and the prosecution argued that he deserved the same fate. The jury deliberated on Hayes's fate, considering both his role in the crime and his expressed remorse. On December 6, 2011, Stephen Hayes was convicted of all charges, including the murders of Jennifer, Michaela, and Haley. The following day, the jury returned with their decision on sentencing. Stephen Hayes was sentenced to death by lethal injection. However, as with Komisarjevsky, Hayes's case would not be resolved quickly. The appeals process would stretch on for years, and despite his conviction, Hayes would continue to challenge his sentence. For the Petit family, and for all those who had followed the case, the lengthy legal battle seemed to add insult to injury. The families of the victims had already endured unimaginable pain, and now they would have to endure years of appeals, delays, and courtroom drama. The trials of Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes were a painful chapter for everyone involved, especially for Dr. William Petit. The trials were meant to bring justice, but they also served as a constant reminder of the brutal loss of his wife and daughters. For Dr. Petit, seeing the two men who had torn his life apart face the justice system brought some measure of closure, but it didn't heal the wounds. The loss was too great, and the pain was too deep. Both men were sentenced to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Komisarjevsky was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Hayes was sentenced to death, though his appeals would continue for years. But for Dr. Petit, there was no true closure. No sentence and no amount of justice could bring back his family. The courtrooms had their verdicts, but the real pain would continue to haunt him for the rest of his life. There have been a few notable updates in the case of the Petit family murders, specifically regarding Joshua Komisarjevsky's legal proceedings. Komisarjevsky's most recent appeal was denied by the Connecticut Supreme Court on April 12, 2024. This appeal had argued that pre-trial media coverage tainted his trial and that certain evidence had not been disclosed to the defense, among other claims. However, the court rejected these arguments, and he remains sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences after his original death sentence was commuted, following Connecticut's abolition of the death penalty in 2015. As we reach the final chapter of this heartbreaking case, it's time to reflect on the pain, the survivors, and the long journey toward healing. The Petit family murders shocked not just the small town of Cheshire, Connecticut, but the entire nation. The brutality of the crime left an indelible mark, but it also sparked a series of personal transformations and societal questions that continue to resonate today. Let's first take a moment to recognize the strength of Dr. William Petit Jr. The trauma he endured, the loss of his wife, Jennifer, and their daughters, Haley and Michaela, was unimaginable. And yet, despite his grief, he found the courage to carry on. In the years following the tragedy, Dr. Petit became a symbol of resilience, using his voice to advocate for justice, fund education through the Petit Family Foundation, and even to serve in Connecticut politics. His work serves as a beacon of hope for those facing unimaginable loss, showing that life, no matter how painful, can continue. But how does one move on from such a tragedy? Can there truly be closure after something so horrific? For many survivors, the answer isn't a simple one. While some might find solace in the courtroom, where justice is served, Others, like Dr. Petit, have learned that closure doesn't come from external forces, but from within. It's about finding ways to live with the pain, honor the memory of lost loved ones, and ensure their legacy lives on. As we look back at the case, it's important to remember not just the heinous actions of Komisarjevsky and Hayes, but the lives of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela. They were more than just victims. Jennifer was a dedicated nurse. Haley had dreams of following her father's footsteps in science, and Michaela was a bright, compassionate young girl with a love for cooking. Their lives were full of potential, and while they were stolen from us far too soon, their stories are still alive in the hearts of those who love them. This case also raises important questions about justice, reform, and the role of the media in shaping public opinion. The long trials, the media frenzy, and the debate over the death penalty all provide a backdrop for reflection. Is the death penalty truly a solution? Can we ever heal from such pain, or do we simply learn to live with it? As we move forward, these questions remain open, waiting for each of us to decide how we will engage with such difficult realities. For Dr. William Petit, and for all of us, the journey doesn't end here. He has continued to show the world that even in the face of such darkness, light can emerge. Through his foundation, through his political work, and his personal healing, he has given hope to many who are struggling to find peace. To the families of those who are impacted by violence, to those who have suffered loss, remember, healing is possible, but it takes time, it takes patience, and most of all, it takes the courage to move forward, one step at a time. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into the tragic events of the Petit family murders. If you found this story moving and would like to hear more, please subscribe to Secrets in the Shadows for more engaging true crime stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature and the resilience of the human spirit. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What are your reflections on this case? And how do you believe we can find justice for victims of such horrific crimes? Stay tuned for more. Stay safe. And remember, the shadows may hold dark secrets, but in the end, it's the light of human kindness that prevails.